Hi, my name is Keith Blackmore. I'm with Vancouver Spark Animation Festival. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Don Peri, the author of a brand new book, Directing at Disney. And this new book explores the evolution of the animation director's role at Disney, particularly in that vital critical period from 1920s to the 1970s, shedding light on how directors even came about and those visionaries behind such classic films as Snow White and Pinocchio. So we're going to dive into the stories, the creative processes that help shape Disney's legacy, and we're going to talk in that deep dive with all those things with Don Peri. So welcome, Don. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Keith.
Real pleasure. What inspired you to write this book?
Um, I think, well, this was, it kind of came out because I was involved with doing talks at the Walt Disney Family Museum. And we had Kevin Corcoran, who is known to a lot of people as Moochie from the Disney television shows and a lot of the Disney movies, was up and he was going to be part of a talk on Old Yeller. And we took him to Pixar because Pete Docter and Jonas Rivera and some other people there wanted to show him around Pixar. And at dinner that night, Jonas suggested that he and I do a talk at Disney, which we did do. And then Pete and I decided to do a talk at Disney. So we decided to do one on Disney directors. So it was really the genesis of the book. We did the talk, and then Jonas said, "You guys should write a book about this." So we started a 10-year odyssey to write our book about Disney directors.
The when you start approaching this, I mean, we're thinking of the earliest days of Disney. They've moved from Kansas. They're in LA. They're in Hollywood now, and they're that period from the 20s to the 70s, as I mentioned. But how do you chronicle that evolution of the director from those short films to features over such a long span of time?
Well, we looked at everything we could that was in print. Fortunately, we were able to use the Disney archives, all of the different branches of the archives. So that was very helpful. I did work with Ben Sharfstein for 3.5 years, so I had a lot of his memories and analysis of the early days. Also, I interviewed Wilfred Jackson, also talking about the early days mostly. And then one of the big pluses for us was getting to use Mike Barrier's archives. And Mike Barrier was the first really Disney historian that most of us knew about with his Funny World magazine. And he let us come to his house in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we just spent 2 days just pouring through the material he had. So that was a huge help for us to recreate these eras.
Yeah, for our audience, if they don't know, Mike Barrier is what a renowned animation historian, written a number of great books on
Yeah.
Disney. You mentioned Ben Sharpstein. Maybe you can talk about Ben and your relationship to Ben, and then we can examine how Ben influence production at Disney.
Okay. Do you want me to explain how I met Ben? Would
Yeah,
that
yeah,
be
tell us that
okay?
story. It's a fascinating story.
Okay.
It's part of his
Okay.
book.
So I live in Davis, California, where a branch of the University of California is. And before it became a branch, it was the University Farm for University of California, Berkeley's. And that was so students could take the train from Berkeley to Davis and learn about agriculture. And Ben was a 1916 graduate of the University Farm and was also, had a career at Disney. And in 1972, he we have an annual event called Picnic Day, and he had done the cover for the program, and inside it had his story. And so I tucked it away. And the next year, I got The Art of Walt Disney, which I can see right behind you on your shelf, for Christmas. And when I read it, I realized that Ben had been mentioned quite a bit in there. So I looked him up in the phone book and wrote him a letter and asked him if he'd sign my copy of the book. And as it turned out, and so my sister and I both went to see him. We thought we'd just be there for a couple hours, but we get to meet somebody who actually knew Walt Disney. And he spent all day with us, and he brought out an Oscar that Walt had let him keep from the Amma Girls that he had produced, brought out a program from Snow White signed by everybody in the studio, and just told us story after story. And I thought he's looking for somebody to help him write his memoirs. And this was on a Friday. And on Monday, I got a letter from him saying, I enjoyed our visit. I'd like to hire you to help me record my memoirs. So we spent 3.5 years where I would record interviews with him and then transcribe them, and we worked our way through his story. And so that opened all the doors for me because everybody I wanted to interview afterwards, if I mentioned Ben Sharpstein, they knew who he was.
So you're at the University of Davis. What year is this that this happened?
1974. So it's
Unbelievable.
been 50
Early,
years.
early days. Early, yeah, 50. Wow. 50.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Ben Sharpstein and
Okay.
his influence at Disney, particularly those films like Pinocchio and Dumbo. But you mentioned he was there even with Snow White. Maybe you can just talk about him as a director and his role
Okay.
in changing
Okay.
direction.
Yeah, he had worked at all the New York studios, and then came to Disney, and worked on, I think he animated on 97 films before he became a director. He replaced Burt Gillette when Burt Gillette left after the success of Three Little Pigs and went to Van Buren Studio in New York. And Ben, so he worked on the early Silly Symphonies and Mickey cartoons, and then he was the supervising director on Pinocchio in the initially by himself, and then Ham Luske joined him later on. And this was a brand new role. I mean, the role was brand new with Snow White because it was the first feature film Disney did, and Dave Hand was the director there. But Ben actually credits himself with bringing the story of Pinocchio to Walt Disney and realizing at the same time that once Walt wanted to do it, that this was going to be a difficult story. It didn't have the charm that Snow White had. It was a darker story, but he did direct that, and then he was the supervising director on the only film that made money during the war years. I mean, after Snow White came out, as probably everybody knows, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi all lost money. Disney almost went out of business,
Mhm.
and Dumbo was the only one that made money. And I think he was able to bring some of the humor and the tightness of story that he had done in some of his earlier cartoons into the production of and direction of Dumbo. He also was criticized because it was a short cartoon, short feature, and he cut out 3 or 4 more minutes of the movie. But he felt he had to tighten the story up, and Walt later defended him with, I think it was RKO was their distributor at the time, about this. We can't make this any longer. This is the way it should be. And for a lot of people, it's their favorite Disney film. So I think, Ben was right in the long run with that.
Well, even just the role of your book examines the role of producer because it was always Walt. Walt was the man, not just producer, director, animator, voice of everything, but his hand was on everything. And
Hmm.
so with we didn't really know who these directors were. And that's part of the
Right.
story. That's why you wrote this because we needed to know.
Sure.
So um, what was Ben doing beforehand, before he did these features? Was he actually as a director with shorts and
Mhm. Yeah.
or
He was part of the shorts team. It was Ben and Dave Hand and Wilfred Jackson were the directors going up into the production of Snow White, and then there's some more people came on as they were trying to do features and live action. So he was a director. He was happy to move from animation into directing, and then he was and after Dumbo, where he was a supervising director, then he moved into production supervisor. So he started to become more of a producer for the rest of his career after that. And and Walt, like you said, Walt was the producer. Walt also really emphasized the role of the producer. He thought that was really important. We had joked about titling our book Between Walt and a Hard Spot because Walt was this visionary who knew what he wanted and pressured his directors to realize his dream. At the same time, the animators are pushing up, thinking, if you're a good animator, you wouldn't be a director. So you can't tell us what to do. And the story people want the story the way they want it. So they really were trying to balance Walt's vision and their own contributions to the story and keep everybody else in moving forward with the goal for the film.
with the first feature with Snow White? You mentioned Dave Hand was the director of it. He was given the reins of that. Um, what challenges did he face? Because this is a brand new role as a director, and it's a brand new role as a feature. It's not just a
Mhm.
7 minute short. We got 70, 80 minutes of
Yeah.
feature. What challenges did he face? How did he go forward in directing that whole film?
Well, Dave was a very organized. I mean, organization was a main feature for him. So he was very organized, and I'm sure we could credit him with bringing the whole idea of sequence directors together. Because even though he was the supervising director, he didn't direct any particular scenes. It was the sequence directors under him who divided the movie up and direct. For instance, Wilford Jackson directed the musical number in Snow White and the ending of Snow White, and different other directors did different parts of it. So, but because he was so good at organization, he was able to keep all of them in line and keep everything moving forward. One quick story. Walt was in the short stays was not was wasn't quite sure what to make of the directors, and the directors were getting attention, especially after Three Little Pigs. So he decided that he was going to be a director again. He had been a director during the silent era in the first early shorts. So he brought Freddie Moore and Norm Ferguson, two of his best directors, together, and he was just going to show them that anybody could do this. And he directed The Golden Touch, and it was not popular within the studio or outside of the studio. But he decided then that he was not going to direct Snow White, and so that's where Dave was able to come in and do that.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned how he had sequence directors. So, for example, Norm Ferguson, he was one of
Uh-huh.
the sequence directors. How did Norm's vision as an animator, how did he, and as a director, how did he push those characters and the boundaries of animation during that production of Snow White or even
Well,
Pinocchio?
yeah, I believe he worked on The Witch in Snow White, and I think he did, and or was it the Queen? Actually, I can't quite remember. I think that each of them brought in uh, their own talents, their own specialties to the characters. So Norm was great at advancing a lot of things about animation, but also he had kind of a more vaudevillian background and liked that kind of broader characters. And I think he was able to introduce that into the characters he did. He directed in Snow White as well as in Pinocchio with, I believe he worked on, if I can remember correctly, The Fox and the Cat, and also was able to bring more of that kind of the broader comedy kind of roles into some of these. Even with the Witch, I think he was able to do that as well.
What did it was a director like the overall director like Ben Sharpstein? He has these sequence directors. Did he have difficulty bringing in a consistent style and such throughout those sequence? Because every director had their own feel and look and what they brought to animation as well. So how difficult was it for Dave, or was it difficult at all to bring it all together in that?
I'm not really sure how, because they had all worked together before, so I'm not sure how hard it was. Although sometimes it's difficult to be the person that now steps up and is other people's bosses. But I'm
Yeah.
not sure if they had a difficulty so much with the sequence directors. I think more at times it would be with the animators, just keeping them within the range of footage and making sure the characters look the same and act the same as they go through the film. I mean, I know some people can look at Pinocchio and say, "Oh, that's Frank Thomas's Pinocchio.
Yeah.
That's so." I can't do that, but some
No.
people can actually see the difference. So I think the idea was to make sure that all of these sequences um, were within the range they were supposed to be, and that they moved the story forward, and there was no jarring change from one sequence director to another.
Yeah, that's my observation is that as particularly animation, keep it consistent and looking the same all throughout. That was probably the
Yeah.
more difficult aspect. Um,
Uh,
every director, as you mentioned in here, was a fascinating story. They brought something new and different. Maybe we can just talk about some other of these directors. For example, I'll give you the name Woolie Reitherman.
uh-huh.
He directed, for example, the Jungle Book. What was his secret to his longevity and his success in that period?
I think it was that he adopted Walt's attitude towards this later part of animation when Walt was now involved with the theme parks and live action movies and everything else was not to have the stories become too involved, but to focus on character development and the personalities of the characters. And it kind of simplified the process a bit. And I think Woolley readily took to that and adopted that and used that as he went forward. He also relied heavily on the nine old men who were still working in animation and helped him through. And because after I think he was a solo director on Sword of the Stone and The Jungle Book. And then after Walt passed away, he became the producer director on a lot of the films. So he really had a quite a range of things, and with a very small crew now to work with compared to the earlier days. So it was very challenging for him, but he was successful in keeping the stories character focused and less complicated stories to deal with.
Now, I was thinking about Fantasia, one of my favorite films. A lot of sequences there. I can't remember the overall director for that film. Maybe you know.
Ben Sharpstein was the production supervisor, and I don't believe there was a supervising director for that. I think that basically he had that role because
Right.
each director of the sequences were a standalone. So
Did that role as a director differ on this project compared to a more of a narrative driven feature? Like
yeah,
how
I don't really know. I don't know. That wasn't something I think we ever talked about.
yeah. Um, Looking as well that period just after Fantasia, of course, we get 1941 with the strike. We have the war, and then we're coming out of the war, and it's the hunt for a communists in America, in Hollywood,
Right.
and uh, and Disney's on the brink of bankruptcy.
Uh-huh.
How did that change, for example, direction? We see now they're going into films like Cinderella and Peter
Mhm.
Pan. How did that need to make those features and yet remain solvent change the way they approached animation?
Well, they had that whole period in the second half of the 40s where they did the package films, so that kept them moving forward, but no huge hits. I think that one of the things that developed was in Ham Luske started doing live action reference footage in Snow White with Marjorie Champion as Snow White, and then continued that in those features to a limited degree. By the time they got to Cinderella, I think they filmed the whole movie in live action reference footage first. And that gave them a chance it saved them some money because there was less of a possible disconnect between what the director is asking the animator for and what the animator thinks the director wants. Because now they're seeing an image and they can work from that common image to what they're actually going to do. So they can vary from that. But it gives them a chance to reduce some of the time that was involved so they could speed up the production of features and save some money. So I think when Cinderella was such a big hit that it really made it all possible to continue on. I remember seeing an annual report for Disney that showed a little line going up and down, and then it gets to 1950 with Cinderella and the line just goes straight up, and that was
Yeah,
not straight up, but on an ascending angle. So that
yeah.
really made a difference for them.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting aspect that them filming just to see the whole film because it gave clarity, as you say, to those animators of what this scene is going to be. Because you might have it as a picture in a storyboard, but
Uh-huh.
their view when you even if the director was to explain it, well, I want it this way, they might understand it another way. But by having
Right,
it clearly, they had a true vision and they could keep on that. And so there was less experimenting and loss of time and money.
right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Also, it gave them a chance if the character in the live action is wearing a dress and she spins around, they can see how long it takes the her dress to stop moving when she stops moving. All the follow through kinds of things were really important for them. And when they got to Cinderella, then they went to the three sequence director formula. So there were three directors then, no supervising directors then, but three sequence directors who pretty much ran the film.
yeah. Clyde, Dronomy,
Hmm.
he had a huge impact as well on films like Lady and the Tramp.
Right.
Maybe talk about his important role in Disney history.
Yeah, he became a director a little later than some of the other people in the book. He yeah, he did some of the really great sequences. I mean, you mentioned the Lady and the Tramp, and he did the great sequence at the end of Cinderella when Cinderella's going to try on the glass slipper, and then before that, when the mice are trying to get the key up to her room, and all of that tension there was all his work. So he was really very effective. is one of the more controversial directors because he didn't always get along that well with the animators.
Mhm.
But Walt felt that out of that um, clash at times, that more creativity would come. So he championed Jerry Geronimi with a lot of his work, and a lot of the sequences in Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a lot of the films are his. So despite whatever issues he had with the people he worked with, he turned in some of the best work that Disney has.
Yeah. Uh, John Lounsbury. Now, he helped transition Disney from that period of the 50s into the 70s, really, with
Yeah.
films like Winnie the Pooh and such. And he
Uh,
had a long career at Disney. Maybe we talk about
yeah.
his role there.
Okay. His career is mostly as an animator, and it was always interesting that he was this kind of a quiet person who would do some of these characters like the Wolf and Peter and the Wolf, or do Stromboli or do some different, not Stromboli, but did some major characters who were very extroverted, and he was kind of an introverted guy. So it was he could so as an acting he could play a different person than he appeared to people to be. He did become a director reluctantly, I think, on the Winnie the Pooh films because I think he still wanted to be an animator.
Yeah.
But Walt was, or they were moving him to come up to maybe replace Woolie Reitherman at some point. And then unfortunately, he died at an early age, and that didn't continue for him.
It was interesting in reading that in your book that many of these directors actually wish they could go back to animation, and they
Yeah,
just love the joy of drawing
yeah,
without because that role as director took them away from that, and they
right.
wanted to get back into it.
Yeah, yeah. I think Wilfred Jackson always wished he had been an animator and wished he could have stayed that way, and just felt like he was kicked upstairs to be a director and had to struggle to be a director, and which is ironic because he's the one that most people wanted to work with,
Yeah.
and Pete and I both, he's our favorite director, so we were both excited about learning more about him, and but yeah, I think he always wished he could have just been an animator.
One of the other things I got from this book is that the intimacy with which they talk about Walt and their role, which we don't see in other books in history, because these men worked directly with Walt
Right,
and
right.
and what Walt was like as a man and or as a person to work with, and that producer. And you mentioned that you touched on a little bit because Walt did not want he wanted to have the glory for himself as a producer. He didn't
Yeah.
like the directors getting the attention when a film was successful, like the Three Little Pigs
Uh-huh.
and that. But yeah, they all had a different relationship with him, didn't they?
Yeah, I think they did. They all saw a different Walt, and I think he was a different person to each of them
Right.
because he knew how to play to their strengths, and how he treated them. He was very I think he was very appreciative of loyalty, and he got that from a lot of these people. And my experience with the ones that with this group who I'd interviewed, as well as everybody else that I talked to, was they mostly used the term awe to describe their feelings about Walt. They were in awe of him. And Just a little aside, when I interviewed Leonard Shannon, who was a publicist years ago,
Mhm.
he said that first time he went in to meet Walt Disney, Walt's secretary said, "Don't fall in love with him." And he thought that was a strange thing to say, but he said he realized over time that a lot of these guys were in love with Walt Disney, not in a sexual way, but he was
No.
like a life partner as much as their spouses were.
Yeah.
And he was way more than a boss to them. And they wanted to please him. He was a charismatic figure, and that affected all of them,
Yeah.
including the directors.
I try to remember the name now. There was one director that quit, that sent
Uh,
resigned. He resigned on Walt, and then almost immediately he regretted it, and he wanted to get back. And Walt sent him a letter. Hey, sorry, buddy, you resigned as your thing. I told
yeah,
you, I
that,
warned you.
yeah, that was Jerry Geronimi.
Oh, Jerry. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
they were over in Europe, and he was working on live action films and didn't want to continue doing that. Wanted to go back to animation, and Walt didn't want
That's what
him.
it was. Yeah. Yeah.
Walt
Yeah.
moved a lot of his directors into television, and with the exception of Ham Luske, who did well there, it was a big adjustment. And in a way, it was a compliment because he was saying, you're the people I work with. I want to bring you into where I'm going now. But it was such a fast pace and so much workload that I think for Wilford Jackson and for Geronimi, it was just more than they wanted to do or could do.
Yeah, they were taking on a big load, especially
Yeah,
with television coming in and Walt
yeah.
with all these other projects. Let's go back to the early days. And
Okay.
uh, I was thinking about, for example, with those shorts, uh, maybe we talk about Goofy, the director of the Goofy shorts. Um,
Jack Kinney, yeah,
yeah,
Jack Kinney
right.
is the one who's best known for those.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think he just pitched an idea to Walt one night about let's do a Goofy cartoon about how to do something. I think it was How to Ride a Horse, maybe was the first one. And
Yeah.
Walt liked that. And so he just went with that series with all of those, which are just delightful to watch. And one of the things then was I think Pinto Colvig had left the studio, so they didn't have Goofy's voice anymore. So a lot of the films were they had a narrator, and Goofy didn't really talk. He laughed occasionally, but they were able to get through the stories mostly with the narrator explaining how to do something, and then Goofy would, of course, do it just the opposite way.
And Mickey, did they have a dedicated director just for the Mickey shorts?
Um, the Mickey shorts when they'd broken it up into groups, so it was Jack Kinney was Goofy, Jack King, and then Jack Hanna were the Donald directors. Nick Nichols was the Pluto one, and Jerry Geronimi I think handled the Mickey's cartoons. Once they kind of split the characters into different units. So he handled the Mickeys until he went into live of rather feature animation.
Yeah, those trio films are brilliant though when they bring them all together with Donald and Goofy,
Yeah,
Mickey.
yeah,
Because Mickey by himself, as I think your book references, he's pretty much a Boy Scout. He's vanilla,
uh,
and these
yeah.
other guys are like Rocky Road and Spumoni,
Right, right,
but
right.
they have a lot more personality.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
much more fun to work with, especially you see it in a film like Clock Cleaners and,
Right, right.
and such.
Or
Yeah,
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 Mickey Service Station and Lonesome Ghosts. All of those are were really fun to
yeah.
and they're all done by a lot of them by different people. So
Yeah,
different
yeah.
characters.
They're
Yeah,
brilliant. And it's amazing when we look back and I show them in class as you show them to individuals. They hold up, here they are, 70, 80 years old, and they still hold up
yeah,
so well.
yeah,
So
yeah.
well. Yeah.
So
What
we
was
have excuse me just for a sec. We have a exhibit that opened last week at the Walt Disney Family Museum on the directors. So it's an exhibit that's based on our book. And if anybody's down our way, it'll be there till March. But one of the things that we have in there that I really like is we were able to pull segments, scenes from the cartoons that all the directors did. So we've got like, I don't know, 7 or 8 monitors set up, and you can sit there and watch clips from Clock Cleaners and all of those for Ben and for what Jackson did and what Han did. So it's a really nice exhibit. And
Well, that's a great way of seeing it as well.
yeah,
And then you can isolate that individual's work and what they put
yeah,
together. Interesting. And that museum, for anybody that doesn't know, is in San Francisco.
San Francisco and the Presidio. Yeah, and
Yeah, yeah, not
it
in
opened on the 17th, and it'll be there till March. And actually, this Saturday, Pete and I are doing a talk on the book at the museum as well. So if you've got any, well, probably by the time people see this, it'll be past that time. But anyway, but at the museum, the exhibit will be there till March. So I encourage anybody to come who has a
yeah.
chance.
One of the things with film, as you know, it's about art and technology.
Right.
Did in making these films that we know there were technological advances like the multiplane camera
Mhm.
for with the old mill, and then of course with Snow White. Um, was there other advances that these directors helped implement that brought in when they were saying, they had a vision of this film and going, okay, I need this, and then they went back into the garage and said, okay, let's figure this out.
Well, I think the innovations are more not technological so much, but Wilfred Jackson created a dope sheet, which became a bar sheet, and then we have X sheets. So a lot of that was developed by the directors, and those were developed so that everybody was on the same page for every frame of footage that went through. Also, Wilfred Jackson put together. Well, they were filming their pencil tests, so they could look at what they did before it was seen. But then he started putting running reels together, and so Those kind of advances were things that really helped them and helped Walt keep up on what they were doing when he wasn't involved with the day-to-day work on the cartoons. So I don't think in terms of like camera kind of things like the multiplane camera innovations, but operational innovations came from the directors and Dave Ham with his organizational charts kind of helped keep all of this chaos going in the forward direction.
What about Webb Smith? What do we talk about Webb Smith's role as creating storyboarding?
Yeah, that storyboarding was something that Walt picked up on and other studios hadn't picked up on that kind of an idea. So I think part of what the genius of Walt was not only that he had talented people who could come up with these ideas, but he actually seized on the ones that were of value. And what he did, everybody else followed. So once he started doing that, other people did it too. But he was the one to recognize the value in these things. And he would approve films just off the storyboards, which current directors find amazing that with that primitive a point in the cartoon, he could say, "Yeah, we're going to go ahead with this." So,
But you look at the films comparatively of that period of time from other studios, Van Buren or
uh-huh.
even some other films that are studios that are non-existent now. And they were just running 600 feet of film just without any sense, just get it done.
Right,
But
right,
now with a storyboard to see the middle, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and
yeah,
what was weak and what was strong, and build it up in pre-production
right,
and then
right,
go. And this is why I think their films stand so well today
uh-huh,
and such. I often talk to my students, we go to Walmart and you go to that bin of DVDs,
uh-huh,
they're two for $5, and there's the one, cartoons that time forgot.
uh-huh,
Well, that's the reason why they're forgotten is because they're lousy. They're lousy
yeah,
cartoons, right? But we never forget these Disney shorts, and we never
right,
forget these
right,
Disney features. And I
yeah.
think a big part of that is some of those little things like a storyboard and these other innovations in animation that they've done.
I think
Um,
when Ben Sharpstein first came to Disney and he was given a scene to do in a film, and he said, I would have, at other studios, we would consider this not a very important scene, but this was an important scene for Walt,
yeah,
and I had to take it more seriously. And also, he would say, when we were looking at a story, we'd look at the easiest way to do it, but that was not the way Walt wanted to do it. Might pick the hardest way to do it because he wanted it to be better. And story was king for Walt. And I mean, I think I remember reading years ago that Chuck Jones said that Charlie Chaplin told him that Walt was the best story man in Hollywood ever. And I
mm,
thought that's a pretty big
that
statement to.
is, yeah, big accolade. Yeah, it's amazing what they were doing. And you're talking about the love that all these animators had for Disney. Don't fall in love, but they had a love for them. And they
Uh-huh.
pushed themselves to elevate their animation in that regard because they knew, like you said, if they're at some other studio, they're just putting it out. I'm just
Right, right.
clocking in. But
Yeah,
these guys, they were doing something more and they want
yeah.
to bring something more to it. It was
I think
amazing.
they knew that they were at the forefront of creating a new art form in the 20th century. Not that Walt had invented cartoons, but he
No.
took it up from being a program filler
Yeah.
to an art form, to something people actually wanted to see. And I think, and Jackson said that Walt had a way of making you feel that what he wanted was so important that you wanted to just do whatever you could to realize that dream. So I think they all shared that. They were, this was the place to be. This was an exciting world to be in.
Yeah. Well, the role of director has changed significantly since those early, early days. I
Yeah.
mean, handing it off to just a lead animator and then making
Right.
them director. Maybe you can discuss the responsibilities of the director or how it transitioned from then to today and how it's different from 1920s to where it is today.
Yeah, well, I think in the 1920s, or actually during a lot of Walt's time, like you said, the story was put together by the story department. The director might have a little bit of a role. Then it was handed to him, and then when it was done, whatever else, any post-production was handled. But yeah, now I think, and I'm mostly familiar with Pixar directors, but I'm sure it's true at Disney as well and other studios, is they usually start the idea for the film and they carry it all the way through. They help write the story, they help pick the music. So it's almost more of an auteur kind of a program, although they've got lots of people working with them. And So it's a much different situation than it was in Walt's time because they're there from the very beginning, and everything that's done, um, um, they're involved with it. So
Right,
it's
right.
and
Yeah.
we know who the directors are. We know who the directors are of movies now, but we don't
Yeah.
necessarily know who the animators are. But it's a Pete Docter movie or a Brad Bird movie or Andrew Stanton movie, but you don't know that it's that Sean Krause animated on or other people who are there, unless you're really interested in the business and you pay attention to who the animators are at each of the studios.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting how it's changed. Um, when you look back, was there anything that was really significant as how they really changed the animated film? I mean, you did talk about this
Yeah.
aspect, but was there any key decisions or any moments that helped define that in the Disney look and the style that became so iconic by these directors? Or was it just collaborative?
I think of it as more collaborative. I mean, I think just in terms of how it's advanced past Walt, the introduction of an editor to the team is something that wasn't there during Walt's time, working on the animated feature. So that's changed some of the dynamics of how the films move through production. And of course, CGI and all of those things have changed things a lot. But I think it was maybe the shifting of the story emphasis to characters over complex story structures that Woolie experienced that probably has carried on longer than some of the other things.
Yeah.
Uh,
You co-wrote this with Pete Docter, as you mentioned. You talked about Pixar. What is, when Pete looks at this as a modern animation director, what did he learn from these early pioneers at Disney?
well, I can't say too much about what he learned, but I know that he, at one point, I think he mentions in the book that when we were reading some of Wilfred Jackson's journal entries, that
Mhm.
he said you could just change the dates on these and it would be the same today as it was then. Some of the struggles or the dynamics between the director and other people that they experienced, he experiences now too. So uh, I think this was something that was a labor of love for him because this is the area where he's working. I mean, where he's excelled, and he gets to see all these other people whose shoulders he's standing on, as well as everybody else is standing on.
Yeah, no, I think you're right in that regard. I think leadership roles as a director doesn't change from decade to decade because you're still just dealing with people,
Right.
right?
Right.
And it's whatever your job it is. Like we always said, the job is easy. It's the
Uh-huh.
people that are hard.
That's
So I'm
right.
sure Pete is having his own experience as much as
Yeah.
Pixar. We love Pixar. So yeah. But yeah, it's amazing that you cover so many. I'd like to ask one more about, I didn't ask about Ward Kimball
Uh-huh.
because he had a very unique approach. I think of his short film, Two Whistle Plunk and Boom,
Uh-huh.
that Walt, he was, not big on the UPA style, but he also
Right.
did like Three Caballeros and
Oh
he had a
yeah.
distinct, very distinct style and
Uh-huh.
contributions to the Disney uh, catalog.
Yeah. Yeah. He was his work really stands out. The things he did, the Cheshire Cat in Alice Wonderland, I think, and the Lucifer in Cinderella and all. So he had brought a very different kind of style to what he did, and he did direct some of the films, like Two Whistle and was it called Music? There was another one right before that, I think,
Make
that was in a.
mine, make mine music.
No, it was a short. I forget exactly what the
Yeah.
title is now, but yeah, he was definitely a character, and that I think showed in his in the kind of work he did and his approach to everything he did. So he was definitely made a big contribution to the Disney animated films.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's an amazing book, and you fill a whole gap in our history and understanding of the Disney studios. There's so
Thank
much
you.
that we've enjoyed, that I really enjoyed reading
Oh,
the
great.
original directors
That's
and
nice.
learning more about not just the nine old men, but all these directors that were there behind. those
Uh-huh.
films. So, Don Perry, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure listening to you and getting some background on your book. And as you mentioned, there's a great presentation until March at the Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. And if you can't get there, you can always buy the book
Right,
and
right.
uh, and watch the movies.
Yeah.
Thank you again,
Yeah. Thank,
Don.
thank you, Keith.
Real pleasure.
My pleasure too.